Yep, it's up.
Okay, great. So I work for Accenture. I'm a senior manager inside of our technology innovation practice. I'm out of Columbus, Ohio, and I've been working in this space for the past 4 years now. I focus on how emerging technologies and new technologies can impact businesses across all different industries. Today, I was asked to talk about supply chain, which is certainly one that I focus heavily on, and I'm going to give a little bit of a different spin, which is the identity side of supply chain. Blockchain and identity is one of my favorite use cases. It's one of my favorite areas to work because I think it's crucial. I often think it's forgotten about, but it's foundational to almost every use case. And I think through this little presentation here, you will see why. So, what is going on with identities and supply chains, or why do I care so much about this? I think across the spectrum, these are some of the challenges that you find. Few guidelines exist, meaning we don't know necessarily how we're supposed to use supply chains. We have different standards, or sorry, identities and supply chains. We have different standards, obviously, to manage identities or to manage data that comes in and out of a supply chain solution, but we don't have very many that are specific to all the different types of identities, and we'll get into that in the next slide. Different solutions, this is very common, obviously, even in the blockchain space, but outside of blockchain, this is a problem as well. Typically people are now in the blockchain world waiting for what is going to be that solution, or if we talk with our clients, right, they often say, what's the most prominent blockchain supply chain solution? And the answer is there will never be just one. So we have to think about, as we build our solutions, how to interoperate. Of course, data is often retouched. On the identity side, certainly as an individual, as you grow, right, your identity changes quite a bit. And think of like a hospital record, for example, right? That data might sit across 200 different healthcare providers. And the aggregate of that is your actual, health card, if you will. So people are constantly touching that data. Something as simple as a weight, for example, or a height might get changed. Data in different formats. Think in supply chain, right? I might use UN location codes where a partner that I work with might have their own standard or their own format for a location code. Someone might write out St. Petersburg with SAINT. Someone else might say ST period. Most countries have different processes. Think just import export, right? This is a huge challenge when we're trying to manage, globally our identity, when someone, as we create an identity in the United States, might not accept that in a different country. Probably the reverse is more prominent, where maybe in a third world or more underdeveloped country, that identity might not be accepted into one of the more established. Data not secure. This is certainly the case in centralized models. We're relying on that data, that identity provider to keep that data safe, and they often do not do that, and hence you see many breaches of people's personal data talked about in the news, every month it seems now. Data might not be correct. This is always the case. There's no client that I've ever worked with who doesn't say, we have garbage data that we need to clean up. The interoperability side, I touched on briefly, but it has to be interoperable not just with solutions, but with organizations, as I mentioned, in different countries, different states, provinces. All of that is important when we think about accepting an identity. We're often not in control. This is certainly the case. I think about, my license sitting right here in front of me. It has my old address on it. I know it's changed, right? The county auditor knows that my address has changed, but yet right down the hall, the Department of Motor Vehicles can't update my address. I think that's quite remarkable. And then lastly, small and medium players are often forgotten. It's not that they're forgotten necessarily, it's just that they're not included in the discussion. So really, we push onto them what we want to create when we are central authorities who have all the power. To set the stage, when we say identities, I just want everyone to realize in a supply chain, identities are much more than just people, right? It's not just a driver, it's not just a captain. It is the organizations, it is all of the things, especially now as things become more connected, but even the unconnected things, the things that do not have sensors on them that are a part of the supply chain, whether that's a certificate of origin, a document, or the goods themselves, they might not be connected. And certainly now, and especially with what's going on and how prominent the food discussion is today, animals, livestock, crops, plants, all of that also has an identity that we want to track. why do we need a digital identity? It's certainly not just to create an identity digitally. It's our business model has changed, right? Everything we now do is online, it is digital. So the physical world and the physical model of identity that we use or are used to for proving who we are, right? You see me on this call right now. Now you know who I am and that I'm speaking. If I were not showing my video, of course, there might be some doubt as to whose voice this is behind the camera. And now when we think about what it's used for, so example, a proof of existence is very prominent, but this is, for an enterprise, it's your incorporation, right? It's something that another party might issue you that says, I prove that this person or this thing or this enterprise exists. The authentication side, this would be, think Twitter, it's your real LeBron James account, right? It's your authenticated account. And authorization, this would be something like I have the ability or the authorization by another party to perform X action. Trusted information, this would be, maybe in the supply chain. I mentioned that example before on a location. Maybe I'm the party responsible for populating the ship from location in this document. So I own that data element, I own that attribute, and I can push that along. The goal, though, is not to simply create a good digital identity. When we think about digital identities, it's not just, hey, I want to make sure Josh is represented accurately on this platform or this product. It is to do these things, right? It is to provide efficiency into the supply chain, to save costs, to provide transparency and trust, and ultimately to create new customer experiences and new experiences for those working in the supply chain and unlock new business models. So on the cost saving side, right, we want to eliminate the need to work with third-party trust providers who are baked into the system as intermediaries to verify and validate our identities. We want to be able to do seamless integration. So, centralized identities that get issued by many providers. I have to manage those as an individual, right? I might have 200 different accounts that I have to log into, which is the current average. 200 different accounts that have a login with my name, as opposed to having one in a seamless integration where I can push information or control information from that identity throughout. Transparency and trust, of course, everyone here on the call who's familiar with blockchain knows that it's certainly efficient for choosing which data you share and with what parties for what authorized use. Eliminating fraud and performing trusted transactions in supply chain, this is very big. I used one example there, but $500 billion in counterfeit goods sold annually. That number is larger today. That stat is a couple years old. But if you think about some companies, actually there are more counterfeit goods sold of their product than there are the actual product, which is remarkable when you think that more people think the fake product is actually the real one. So I love to use that example because it's so prevalent to an industry. It's certainly much more prevalent to a company who is trying to get their product to market, yet more people think it's fake than it actually is. And then new experiences. This is making things easy, having a verifiable credential that can be passed, right? So if I have a driver's license, for example, can I pass that as proof of X, Y, Z to my different transportation companies that I work with? Some principles really that should be used in implementations to capture value with digital identities. Obviously, be valuable and useful. The World Economic Forum, they give these 5 elements for user value. I think that we could definitely use those, but the point here is just make sure that when you create an identity, it's not just to do it, but that there is some purpose, something that you're achieving as per the categories on the previous slide. Be minimal and transparent. The goal here is not to create a competitive edge. It is to create something that works, that is ingestible across maybe even industries, but certainly across the size of the providers, and make sure that we can quickly integrate to the different solutions that we want it to. Ecosystem enabled. I think this one is very important because today in the centralized model, we think of issuing an identity for a product that we might create, and that's the most important thing. Well, customers today and users, even for the companies that we work for, they're gaining better experiences elsewhere. And as such, they're going to turn their head and start looking to solution providers who create those better experiences. And I'll give an example here when I talk about the cross industry. Cross industry. So think about how the identity that you create might be federated across a different industry. I'll use Amazon as an example. Amazon, they're thinking about now how they can create insurance solutions, right, for their own employees. And that's quite remarkable about how they're going to take their employee data, their employees' identities, and use that to provide insurance. Limiting silos. You'll never have, I don't think you'll ever have a global identity solution, but we want to restrict the amount of identities that we manage and make it as simple and easy to transact and do business as we possibly can. And then, of course, decentralize. The key here is not simply to decentralize and use blockchain. It is to provide identity solutions that are self-managed. I should control every aspect of my identity. The data that gets shared with partners about me, I should choose who gets to see that, for how long, for what purpose, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that is the same case for the organizations that we're talking about as well. Now, I want to introduce the archetypes. I've said a few times centralized, but just to be clear, there are 3 unique archetypes when we talk about identity solutions. Centralized, that's your traditional model. It is certainly very mature. These solutions are what we all use today. The example I have down at the bottom is the Department of Motor Vehicles issuing a driver's license, but think of anything, right? Social Security Administration issuing our identity at birth, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These solutions are very much controlled by the organization that issues them. We have very little access or control to change them, certainly not in real time. There's usually a process that we have to go through to make sure that happens, and obviously multiple steps of approval. The federated model, which folks might be less familiar with, is where I create an identity on one platform or with one organization, and they pass that on to another organization, which accepts that because the first organization created it, and I trust that organization, this identity must be valid. The example I give here is Words with Friends, logging in with Facebook. So if you've ever played Words with Friends, you know exactly what I'm talking about, how you can log in with your Facebook account. These are also fairly mature solutions. They've been around for a while. They're not that different than centralized in the sense that they all rely back on some central authority to protect our identity, to issue that identity, to manage it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, in the decentralized model, as I mentioned before on the previous slide, this is about putting self-management in place so I can control who gets to see what for how long. Now, I use an enterprise example here at the bottom, and because I know Lucy was on and spoke yesterday, the Mobi VID is a great example of this. The vehicle identifier and the standard that they created for vehicle IDs, that is exactly what we talk about when we're talking about a decentralized identity. And if you think about the vehicle, what is some attestation that might be passed to it? Well, a simple one here is the registration of that vehicle, or the insurance of that vehicle, or the ownership of that vehicle. So what does this all look like? And this is a hairy slide, but I wanted to kind of try and lay it out there so it could be depicted. As I mentioned before, I don't believe we will ever move to fully decentralized. So what we want, though, is a decentralized solution where, if you look in the center of the screen here, right, you have a company which has employees, the enterprise itself, and some assets, for example. Right, a company's employee should be able to manage their identity at the very minimal. Now, I put some things on here. They were select for purposes, but so let's take the employee. Let's look at this employee kind of lane first. The employee might have an immunization record, which is issued by a medical care provider, right? It says this person got the flu shot. Right, that gets issued to me by the medical care provider, and then in my identity wallet, I carry an attestation from them that says it happened. It is then my choice to choose whether or not I share that with my enterprise if my enterprise is asking me to prove that I did get this immunization to gain access to go to work. Now, as I mentioned, why centralized models will exist, this is a great example. The Department of Motor Vehicles probably is not going to ever relinquish control of granting commercial driver's license. So that is still going to be something that they will do. And then again, I can pass and prove that that CDL, it was issued to me by the authorized party over to my enterprise to prove that I can apply for this job. So the same thing kind of goes true, around the edge of this box, the dotted box. You can see that in the bottom middle there, the Secretary of State would issue an incorporation. I put in there the vehicle ID. So think, Mobi VID here. The truck manufacturer might issue a vehicle identifier for that truck that it can pass ownership over to the enterprise of that asset. And then over here on the left, to kind of paint a picture of what a federated model would look like, this would be something where the employee is acting on behalf of the enterprise. So they're logging into, a web portal that perhaps the Department of Transportation has, but they're logging in not as an individual, but as an employee of the enterprise, right? So the enterprise has federated, this employee has access to create or to request a vehicle registration for this commercial truck. So I think it's very important to understand that identities in supply chains are certainly very valuable for some of the reasons that we've already talked about, but we should consider the identity far beyond the supply chain. We should look, end to end at the value chain. And I'm sticking with an automotive lens just to keep it consistent. But when you think about the vehicle, right, in the future, the vehicle really is at the center of this ecosystem. So the supply chain there is kind of in blue, or at least the first half of it, those blue and white boxes is the supply chain, right? You got your suppliers, your dealers, after sales, all of the parties that are involved in bringing a vehicle to market. But if you think operationally and then all the way to retirement, and then, the sustainability side of tracking the parts on the vehicle, that is circular. So identity goes far beyond just supply chain. And looking at that outer rim and some of what you see in white, these are all the different types of sensors and identities that are going to be associated. And of course, the enterprises in the blue and white boxes, those also have identities. So these are all the different types of identities, right? A car might have a person who gets in gets in that vehicle for 30 minutes for one Uber trip. But in that Uber trip, they might, buy a Netflix show, they might buy a coffee, or they might buy right of way as they're zooming down the highway late to the airport. So there's all these things that we will want to capture that are all about unique identities and proving that not only the people, but maybe the different devices are doing business with each other, that they all are authorized to do the things that we are asking them to do. So I think this is really important, though, and this is why, to me, identity is so foundational for any use case, supply chain related or not. Most of the organizations that we work with, identity comes up at some point because it's everywhere, it's essential. Some recommendations. So these are just some thoughts to kind of close with. As we've gone through implementations, these are things that we like to consider, and we have a roadmap, or I guess, a list of questions that we kind of ask and then check boxes that we mark for doing any type of identity solution. But this is to highlight some of them. So the first thing is consider the transition of archetypes, right? Current solutions, and even in the blockchain space, current solutions certainly have a lot of centralized identity providers, and they always will. But we are going to transition more and more to decentralized models. So plan for that. Bake that into your solution. Consider what it means to have an identity move from a centralized provider to a decentralized self-managed solution. Second here is call it out. So in your industry groups, and I'm a part of quite a few of these, especially in the blockchain space, not everyone is talking yet about identity, but I certainly think it should be, because at very minimal, we have identity of enterprises, but certainly enterprises almost always have assets, and if they have employees, they do. And then of course, as individuals. So identity should be something that we need to get a buy-in from the industry about how we're going to manage it. I can reference MOBI here again. You know, the MOBI standard really more than anything else to me on VID is an agreement between the OEMs and the other supply chain partners that this is what we are going to call identity. It doesn't have to be a fully thorough baked out solution. It has to be an agreement, and that's what this is about. Next is leverage existing work. There are a lot of organizations who are touching on identity in some capacity, whether they are a standards organization, whether they are a company trying to do it and commercialize it. So I put, or a platform, right, who's focused on identity. I put Indy down there. All of these are examples of where identity is a focus. So make sure you do a scan and not rewrite the book. And then next here is invite your uncle. So bring the government in, right? The government, especially in international trade, is certainly the catalyst for transformation. If we want all the different parties to, accept a bill of lading, what do we need to do? We need to get all of those authorities engaged and rewrite the rules. So bringing the government in and having them be a part of that process early and often certainly will help as we try to make the transition to more decentralized, more efficient solutions. Next here is excel at change. So what this is about is, identities are going to change. Obviously, our identity changes as we grow, as we have kids, as we, buy things or changes happen to us. Identities certainly change for us. But if you think back on the asset side, very simply, an asset might get transferred, right? I might own a big piece of heavy equipment that I sell to a competitor to mine, or I sell back to the manufacturer. So all of the, I would say, data attributes or events that happened with that asset that were captured during the time I owned it, are those going to be passed along as well because they're all sitting on chain, sorry? Those are the types of things that you have to consider when you talk about identity, because certainly every record that gets captured, we want to make sure we can protect the privacy or the corporate confidentiality associated with that asset. And then lastly here is design for adoption. So this really goes back to, consider the whole ecosystem. When we talk about, making identities acceptable, it has to be something that is very light, low code, easy to integrate with, easy to adopt, and that, think about some of the more remote places who don't have the full, the full level of assets that we might hear in some developed countries or with some big enterprises. They need to be able to at least accept or create their own identity in some of these solutions because they're a part of these supply chains. So they do business with us here. So it can't be forgotten. And I think maybe just to kind of summarize it up, when I talk about keeping things simple, we like to think about great identities being, identities we really don't have to think about. So that they go to the background, they just work. When you design something that is great in a solution that could be implemented, the identity should not be an inhibitor. It shouldn't be something that even comes up. It should be something so light and so efficient that it fits right into our solution and everybody says, exhale, that was a great, easy one. So 5 minutes left. I wanted to save them for any questions. I saw there were some on the app before it started, and I'm not sure if any came in. Maybe I can pull those up, or if any are in the chat here. Let me check that one, I guess, first.
Yeah, the ones that were there before, I don't think those were actual questions, but there are now, I think, 4 questions in the Whova app. If you can pull that up, that's fine. Otherwise, I can feed them to you.
I'm pulling it up now. If you have them up in front of you, you can go ahead.
All right, sure. I'll just go with the top question, which is, I have heard that the security of a blockchain supply chain is the transparency inherent in smart contracts. Is that true?
I don't think so. The security the security, I guess I don't know what they mean by security in the supply chain itself. So if someone could ask or expand upon that question, it would be great. But the way I read that, the supply chain or the data that is generated in these platforms, it's not secured by the smart contracts. So I'm not sure exactly what that means, but the logic for which we transact or which we authorize certain actions to occur in the supply chains certainly sits in those contracts. But I think, jumping back to maybe the security portion of that, one of the recommendations that we have, and maybe this, I'm sure that question, I'm not sure if it came in during the talk or before, but if it's identity related, I mean, we're very stringent at Accenture about the type of data that we would ever put on chain related to identity. And PII data simply is not something that we would ever permission to be on chain.
Right. You'd be breaking a lot of laws even if you did want to.
Yep.
Okay. Here's another one. How often do you see clients or others applying decentralized architecture where federated architecture is sufficient?
I think, well, I mean, federated is quite centralized as it is. But I think for the most part, depending on if you're really working more on the platform side or a product side, it changes. If you're working with products, you typically will try to federate. If you're working on creating a new platform, they typically want to try to centralize and own that identity. But if there is a government issued identity, that one mostly gets ingested, because right now those are our trust providers, and going forward they probably won't change depending on who that government is. I will say there are certain governments, though, that are working on identity solutions that can be more federated or certainly decentralized even. A great example of that might be KTDI. It's the Known Traveler Digital Identity Project, which is happening with a couple different nationalities. When that project was started, it was identity and being able to ingest that identity down chain. Like, say, for example, if I travel from one of those nationalities to the other, and that identity being able to grant me access to a hospital or to a hotel in that other nationality, it was considered from the start, and that's exactly what we would recommend.
Awesome. Okay. And then I guess it looks like it's kind of building on that. Can the DMV not be likened to a certificate authority in a federated network?
Yes, they can. So the DMV, they would grant certificates. I mean, so take the human, for example, right? The human identity, or I'll go back to that slide. We call it, and you'll hear it mostly called this around the industries, but a foundational identity, like my Social Security identity here in the United States, that would be owned and created, of course, by the Social Security Administration. The DMV would pass me a certificate or an attestation that basically says I've earned my driver's license, or whatever they are authorized by the national government to issue to me.
Sure. And then the last one here. Thoughts on baseline protocol for supply chain or identity management in enterprise environments?
I would say, so we vetted, and I'm assuming that's on the platform side, yes. If that's in which chat, I don't know, but I would.
Yeah.
Yep, I would say, we've done a very thorough investigation, and we continue to do this with new platforms and protocols that come to market. And we have a very short list of approved solutions. This is, of course, Accenture, for which we would do any type of identity work with. It doesn't mean that you could not, build some of the features that some of those platforms provide into other protocols. It's just certainly overhead that you wouldn't want to take on. But I would say on the identity side, there's really two. And if you're curious which they are, we could maybe talk about that later.
Okay.